It began with a noise that none of them could describe. Not footsteps, not weather, not pipes shifting in the walls. The family later told investigators that the first sound came late one night in early March, just after 2 in the morning, from the far end of the hallway near the children's room. It was soft at first, like paper being dragged across the floor, then a slow, rasping exhale, as though something had been lying on the floorboards for hours, simply waiting for someone to wake up and hear it breathe. According to the surviving sister, it stopped the moment she sat up in bed. She watched the shadows under her door, waiting for movement. There was none, only silence, and then the heavy air feeling that the house had changed while she slept. What she could not articulate until much later was that the silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied. The family lived in Faisalabad, in a narrow concrete house at the edge of the city where commercial development met older farmland. Locals still spoke of the place as if it was two worlds forced together. Modern storefronts and working people on one side, and on the other, fields, shallow graves, unmarked shrines, and trees tied with strips of cloth for purposes rarely spoken about in public. The house itself had belonged to an uncle who had died more than a decade earlier. He had willed it to the children's father, Amir, on the condition that it remain in the family. Nothing about the place appeared unusual. There were no legends attached to it, no tales of hauntings or tragedy. It was simply an old house built in the late 1970s. Its windows had once been tinted blue. Its wiring was brittle. Its walls were thick but uninsulated, the sort of place that gave off heat in the day and trapped cold at night. According to testimony gathered later by an attending parish liaison, the first changes inside the household did not involve voices, objects moving, or any overt signs of occult interference. They involved behavior, silence, and sleep. The children, twin siblings, Nadia and Farid, began waking up exhausted. Their teachers said they struggled to stay awake in school. Their mother, Samina, told neighbors that the twins had started talking in their sleep, whispering fragments of sentences in languages she did not recognize. At first she assumed they were mimicking something they had heard online or on television. But she soon noticed that both children whispered at the same time, in sync, as though responding to someone neither of them could see. Medical explanations seemed most likely. Sleep disorders, anxiety, or night terrors. A doctor prescribed vitamins and recommended better sleep hygiene. Nothing changed. According to school records, both children's grades dropped rapidly within a month. The more disturbing behavior came from the oldest sibling, 19-year-old Mariam. She had always been quiet, studious, and introverted. According to a close friend who later gave a sworn interview, Mariam had been planning to apply for a scholarship in Lahore. But within 2 months of moving into the uncle's house, she abandoned the idea entirely and claimed without explanation that she would not be leaving the property for a while. There were no verbal threats, no signs of violence, and no explicit delusions. Her father described her behavior as withdrawn, and her mother described it as like she was listening to someone. That phrasing would come up again during testimony. It was not meant poetically. Multiple family members insisted that Mariam often turned her head slightly, as though someone had leaned in close and whispered directly into her ear. The local physician suggested depression. A psychiatrist suggested medication. No one suggested spiritual interference. Not yet. The first explicitly alarming incident occurred 10 weeks after they moved in. It was a Saturday. According to church case notes, Amir had gone to fetch tea from the market before noon. Samina was preparing lunch in the kitchen. The twins were supposed to be watching a nature documentary. Mariam had been in her room since early morning. Around 12:47 p.m., Samina heard a sound from the second floor, a short, sharp impact like a heavy object slamming into a wall. She expected to find something broken or one of the children injured. Instead, she found Mariam sitting on the floor of her bedroom, facing the wardrobe, staring at a circle of black ash drawn just inches from her bare feet. The ash was thick, heavy, and unevenly spread. It looked to Samina as though someone had burned incense until nothing was left but powder, then pushed the remnants into a circle using their hands. According to documentation written later by a diocesan investigator, The ash contained traces of clay, burnt hair, and some form of oil. Miriam's hands were clean. When asked where it came from, she reportedly did not speak. She did not look frightened. She did not appear confused. She simply turned her head to the left and listened to an unheard voice before saying, with complete calm, "It is not finished." Her mother dragged her downstairs and called Amir to come home. The ring of ash remained in the bedroom for 2 days before anyone swept it away. No one in the house mentioned it again, but something had shifted. According to the twins' later account, the house began to smell of metal and damp soil, though no one else detected it. What followed shortly afterward was not dramatic, not theatrical, and not loud. It was quiet deterioration. The twins stopped sleeping altogether. Miriam rarely ate. Amir developed severe headaches. Samina reported feeling watched at night, as if someone was standing at the corner of the bed, waiting to be acknowledged. A family friend, Rafiq, visited during this period and would later provide one of the most important external testimonies. He recalled that when he entered the house for the first time, every door in the hallway was open except for Miriam's. He claimed that as he passed it, the handle turned once very slowly, though no one was inside. He also claimed that the air inside the house felt heavy in a way he could not attribute to humidity or lack of ventilation. His exact wording in the interview was, "It felt like the house was thinking." By early June, 3 months after the family had moved in, the situation escalated beyond psychiatry or sleep disturbance. According to records later submitted to the bishop's office, Samina found a small object under Miriam's pillow. It was wrapped in cloth, tied with red thread, and coated in oil. Inside was a clump of hardened soil mixed with small metal pins and strands of hair. The origin of the material was never conclusively identified, but the bishop's office categorized it as ritualistic in nature, consistent with the assemblages used in certain forms of black magic intended to induce binding, illness, or spiritual weakening within households. Samina confronted Miriam in the kitchen with the object. The girl looked at it, blinked twice, and asked calmly, "Who put that there?" Her tone suggested that she genuinely did not know. A more chilling detail came from the twins, who insisted that the object smelled like the earth near the irrigation canal behind the house, a place they had been forbidden to go. When questioned, both children claimed that someone buried things there before we moved in. It was this detail that first pushed Amir to speak with a cleric. Before any exorcism case is formally reviewed by the church, an extensive process of elimination takes place. Physicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists are consulted. The church has little interest in dramatics or misdiagnosis. The priority is exclusion, rule out the medical, the neurologic, the psychiatric, the environmental, and the fabricated. Only when all of those fail does the church initiate spiritual inquiry. In this case, the church did not intervene for another 5 months. During those months, the family deteriorated further. Nadia began sleepwalking. Farid developed panic attacks that bordered on dissociative episodes. According to a report written by a child psychologist, both described a figure inside the house that stood near the ceiling. The description was consistent between them, but never mentioned in front of one another. Samina began hearing whispers through the walls, especially after midnight, as though conversations were taking place in rooms she knew were empty. Amir developed persistent nosebleeds and migraines that left him bedridden for days. As for Miriam, her behavior crossed from withdrawal into something clinical. She would sit in the courtyard at night without a light, listening to the air. She was once found kneeling in the dirt behind the house, staring at a spot she refused to explain. On another occasion, she woke the family before dawn by knocking repeatedly on each door, saying nothing. Neighbors later reported that they often saw her in the attic window at night, standing completely still, her face turned toward the fields behind the property. A turning point occurred in late September, documented in detail by both family accounts and the church investigation. It was near dusk when the twins returned from school and discovered that the courtyard gate was open. At the center of the courtyard, directly on the stone tiles, lay a burlap bundle tied shut with cord. Amir cut it open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a slaughtered chicken, head removed, but the blood was dry and the body cold. Wrapped within the feathers were small bones, an inverted iron nail, and a piece of paper containing a handwritten scripture passage written backward. Beneath that was a compacted mass of clay shaped loosely like a human figure, with a rusted pin through its abdomen. Local authorities suspected vandalism or intimidation. Family friends suspected black magic. According to a church consultant familiar with cases from the region, the assemblage matched operational methods associated with malefic ritual practice intended not for immediate harm, but for erosion, weakening the target's health, disrupting sleep, and fracturing household unity. Within 48 hours of the bundle's appearance, Miriam began speaking at night. Not shouting, not chanting. Speaking, calmly and with apparent clarity, in a language no one recognized. It was not Arabic or Persian. It was not the liturgical register of Urdu. The church would later submit a phonetic transcription to scholars who tentatively associated it with fragments of older dialects used in devotional and ritual contexts, though no definitive match was found. Witnesses also noted that her voice sounded split, as if one breath carried two overlapping tones slightly out of sync. At this stage, psychiatric intervention intensified. A neurologist ordered scans and blood work. A specialist evaluated her for temporal lobe epilepsy. Tests came back clean. The attending psychiatrist noted that while Miriam exhibited dissociative tendencies, she showed no signs of hallucinations or delusional architecture. Her responses during evaluation were coherently structured. She denied hearing voices. She denied harming herself. She denied knowledge of any ritual objects or practices occurring within the house. Yet the deterioration continued. The twins' sleep disorders reached a breaking point. Both developed episodes of night terrors lasting up to 40 minutes. According to Samina's testimony, they screamed without recognizing her, even when fully awake. On multiple occasions, they claimed the house was full of people, though they could not describe who. Family tensions grew. Amir began sleeping in the living room. Samina avoided the attic. None of them used the courtyard after sunset. Then came the night that finally pushed the case beyond medicine and into the church's jurisdiction. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the sound returned. The same dragging, rasping breath that had woken the family months earlier. According to the church record, Amir was the first to hear it. It came from the hallway, slow and dry, like someone inhaling through a mouth full of dust. He got out of bed quietly, afraid to disturb Samina. He stepped into the hallway and saw nothing, only the open door of Miriam's room. The air smelled like clay. The twins were already awake, standing in the doorway at the far end of the hall. Both stared at something Amir could not see. Then Miriam appeared. She walked into the hall barefoot, her hands loose at her sides, her head lowered. According to testimony, she moved as though guided, not conscious. The twins did not scream. They backed away, slowly, watching her. Amir called her name, but she did not respond. What happened next would later be cited by the diocesan investigator as the moment the family passed from suspected psychological crisis into an active possession case. Without raising her head, Miriam lifted both hands and pressed her palms flat against the wall. Then, with no increase in pace or expression, she began to speak, her voice quiet but layered, as though multiple voices were occupying the same body. The words were foreign, disjointed, but rhythmic. Amir reached for her arm. She stopped speaking and lifted her head. According to the twins' later testimony, her eyes did not look vacant or wide. They looked focused, as though she was not reacting to them, but to someone standing behind them. When Amir tried again to pull her away, the lights in the hall went out. The twins began crying. Samina rushed from the bedroom. There was no screaming, no furniture thrown, no theatrics. There was only the sound of breathing, close, heavy, and not aligned with anyone's chest. The moment the lights returned, Miriam collapsed. She had no memory of the event when she woke. Within a week, Amir contacted the church through an intermediary. The church documented the case fully before assigning it to the Office of Spiritual Investigation. Their initial findings focused not on visions, voices, or physical events, but on objects, materials, and patterns consistent with black magic operations. When questioned privately, A relative admitted that unknown individuals had recently inquired about the family's inheritance and that disputes had been brewing over land previously owned by the uncle. According to the diocesan report, such disputes in the region had historically been catalysts for black magic engagement, particularly when assets involved property, lineage, or marriage. The next phase involved direct church observation of the household. A liaison priest visited discreetly, dressed not in vestments but in plain clothing. His written notes remain one of the strongest sources documenting the family's state. He described the atmosphere inside the home as oppressive, the children as exhausted beyond the capacity of ordinary sleeplessness, and Miriam as aware of things that were not visible to those present. He noted that her gaze often turned to corners or thresholds, as though monitoring the edges of rooms. What concerned him most was the courtyard. When he stepped outside, he found small depressions in the soil near the gate, as though objects had been buried and exhumed multiple times. He also observed thin markings on the tiles near the wall, made with either ash or charcoal. The markings were partial, but the curvature suggested sigils or seals used in certain binding rites. The priest concluded that the house was not merely affected by black magic, but had been selected. By mid-October, the Office of Spiritual Investigation authorized a full case review. They consulted physicians, reviewed psychiatric evaluations, and interviewed neighbors. Medical explanations failed to account for the ritual objects, the courtyard sigils, the nocturnal patterns, the linguistic anomalies, and the consistent behavioral changes across multiple family members. As they debated formal classification, a second incident occurred, described in church documents as volitional interference during prayer. Amir had been reciting a short devotional prayer beside Miriam's bed while the priest observed. His daughter remained calm, not agitated, not violent. But as Amir recited the final line, Miriam exhaled sharply and whispered something in a tone not matching her own. The priest recorded the phrase phonetically. Transcription analysis suggested it referenced a barrier or obstruction. Miriam's eyes remained closed throughout. Within minutes, she began speaking again, quietly and coherently, in the same unfamiliar language. According to the transcript, the cadence resembled recitation, not glossolalia. The priest later noted that she displayed no signs of hysteria, no hyperventilation, no sympathetic stress responses consistent with psychogenic manifestations. She spoke as though fully aware of meaning and structure. This incident shifted the church's interpretation of the case. Where possession cases often present through violent outbursts, contortions, or aggression, this case presented with intelligence, coherence, and strategy, traits more consistent with cases involving black magic attachment rather than spontaneous or opportunistic spiritual influence. By the end of the month, the church authorized the preparation of an exorcism protocol. Before proceeding, they instructed the priest to gather additional testimony from neighbors and extended family. The testimony revealed two alarming details. First, according to a neighbor who had lived beside the uncle for years, the property had been subject to disputes long before the family inherited it. Several individuals had threatened to acquire the land through means not spoken openly. Another neighbor reported seeing people on the property late at night months before the family moved in. He claimed they carried lanterns and dug near the boundary wall. Second, and more critical, an elderly woman from the village identified the bundle found in the courtyard as sending work, a form of magical dispatch used to introduce spiritual entities into a household. According to her, such dispatches often require burial components, blood, and an unseen invitation into the home. When the liaison priest asked her how such an invitation might have been granted, she pointed to the house itself and said, "When they left it empty." The uncle's house had been unoccupied for nearly 10 years before the family moved in. Church records indicate that this testimony, combined with the ritual items and behavioral symptoms, led to the conclusion that the family was not suffering from isolated possession. They were experiencing progressive infestation designed to weaken the household before establishing control over a primary host. The selected host was identified as Miriam. The exorcism was scheduled for the first week of November. It began quietly, without ceremony, without observers, without drama. The twins were relocated to a relative's house. Samina stayed with them, Only Amir remained. The church initially attempted minor rites, focusing on dislodging attachment rather than confrontation. These minor rites lasted 3 days. During them, Miriam spoke rarely and kept her eyes closed. She flinched only when scripture referencing liberation was read aloud. On the 4th day, something changed. The priest noted that the room's temperature dropped significantly. Amir noticed the smell of soil again. Then Miriam opened her eyes and said, "He is coming." Though no one asked who she meant, the priest asked calmly whom she was speaking of. She raised her hand and pointed not at him or at her father, but at the floor beside the bed, as if someone stood exactly there, just beyond the reach of human sight. She then spoke a sentence in the unknown language. The priest wrote it down phonetically. Scholars later noted that the verb form implied arrival, not possession. At that point, the exorcism protocol was escalated to full rite. The rite began shortly after midnight, started conventionally: prayer, scripture, invocation, then silence. Minutes passed. Then Miriam began to breathe heavily, her eyes still open, her pupils dilated. She whispered a word repeatedly, soft, clipped, and rhythmic. The priest recognized its phonetic structure as similar to the backward scripture found in the burlap bundle. Amir sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly. The priest continued the rite. Then the house responded. It began with a thud from the attic, another from the courtyard. The lights flickered. The priest raised his voice. Miriam shut her eyes and arched her back slightly, not violently, but as though something passing through her ribcage resisted the prayer. The rite intensified, and then the whispering began. It came from the corners of the room, faint and dislocated, as though multiple voices were speaking from within the walls. Amir pressed his hands against his ears. The priest continued, refusing interruption. Miriam opened her mouth, but the voice that emerged was not hers. It was lower, steady, and entirely articulate. It spoke once directly at the priest. Then it fell silent. According to the priest's notes, the voice was so composed that for a moment he questioned whether Miriam was speaking at all. There was no tremor, no strain, and no distortion. It sounded as if someone else was standing in the room, addressing him directly. The words were recorded phonetically, then translated by a consultant familiar with pre-modern ritual terminology. The closest interpretation suggested a phrase meaning, "She is not finished." The ambiguity of the sentence disturbed the church investigators. It implied process rather than torment, cooperation rather than subjugation. In cases involving black magic attachment, the church had long observed that spiritual coercion often aimed toward incremental control rather than chaotic spectacle. A target was not merely to be frightened or debilitated. They were to be made compliant. Miriam's breathing slowed after the phrase. Her eyelids fluttered once, then closed. The priest continued the rite, but the room remained hostile. The whispering persisted in bursts, sometimes near the ceiling, sometimes near the floorboards, then vanished abruptly, leaving a hollow sense of displacement in the air. At 3:12 a.m., the temperature in the room normalized. Amir collapsed forward, exhausted and shaking. The priest ended the rite. Miriam slept without movement for nearly 12 hours. The church adjourned the session and instructed Amir to maintain strict privacy. They forbade extended family from visiting. They warned against discussion of the rite with neighbors. They insisted on keeping the rites contained, as cases involving black magic transfer sometimes exploited witnesses, spreading symptoms or intensifying manifestations through attention alone. The next day, the priest inspected the house with deliberate precision. He examined the courtyard tiles, the boundary wall, and the irrigation canal behind the property. It was during this inspection that one of the most disturbing discoveries in the entire case was made. At the base of the canal embankment, partially hidden by reeds and refuse, he found 6 fabric bundles, identical in structure to the one previously discovered in the courtyard. Each bundle was tied with cord and packed with hardened soil and pins. One contained feathers, another bone fragments, a third traces of dried blood. A fourth contained a thin slice of parchment etched with an intricate design burned into the surface. The fifth contained ash mixed with hair. The sixth contained a small clay figure positioned with its arms over its head, as though bound. These bundles were buried in a shallow trench less than 20 meters from the property line. They had not been placed recently. The soil around them suggested they may have been in place months or even years before the family moved in. When questioned later, a neighbor recalled seeing a man standing near the canal late at night, sometime before the family's relocation. He carried a lantern and a sack. He stood for nearly an hour, lighting incense and placing objects into the earth. The neighbor assumed it was a folk ritual intended for healing or protection, common in certain rural communities. He paid it no further attention. But scholars consulted by the church identified the configuration as one used in malefic operations intended to fragment household unity, drain vitality, and prepare a host for possession. The bundles functioned as anchors, binding influence to the land rather than the building. Such operations could persist even if occupants changed. The church removed the bundles immediately and ordered them burned according to protocol. But those familiar with such cases knew that destroying the anchors did not reverse the damage. It merely prevented further reinforcement. By the fourth day after the first full rite, Miriam's behavior changed again. She became alert, lucid, and quiet, but not in the withdrawn manner seen earlier. Instead, she observed. She watched people's faces when they spoke, listened carefully to conversations, and tracked movements throughout the house. Her father described it as living with someone taking notes. When the priest sat with her privately, she asked questions that unsettled him. She asked how often people forgot what they said when they were asleep. She asked whether voices could enter dreams without waking the body. She asked if people could belong to more than one family at a time. Her tone was calm and curious. None of the questions appeared symptomatic of mania or psychosis. She spoke without distress, and yet every question suggested the presence of an interlocutor, someone communicating concepts or information from outside her conscious cognition. The priest reported these interactions to the diocesan office. They instructed him to proceed with the second phase of the rite. The second phase was conducted on a Friday, beginning shortly before sunset. This time, the twins had returned to the house. The church did not prefer involving children in the home during rites, but the priest insisted that removal of family members sometimes destabilized hosts who drew strength or coherence from relational structures. The objective was not confrontation, but separation. The rite began with prayer in low cadence. Miriam sat upright in bed, eyes open, hands resting in her lap. The twins waited in the hall, instructed to remain silent. Amir stood near the doorway, his posture tense, as though bracing for something unseen. The first hour passed without incident. Then the lights dimmed, not flickering and not from mechanical failure. The bulbs remained lit, but the illumination seemed to retract, leaving shadows heavier than the light could penetrate. The priest continued reading. Miriam turned her head sharply toward the open doorway. She smiled faintly, a gesture not recorded previously in the case. The priest asked whom she had seen. She replied softly, "The little ones." The twins froze in the hall. Amir stepped in front of them. The priest pressed forward, the rite now at a critical juncture. Miriam's attention shifted. She lowered her head slightly and inhaled sharply, as though tasting the air. Then she spoke again in the unknown language, this time with rapid cadence and layered tonal structure. The priest attempted to drown it with scripture, but the tempo escalated. According to the church transcript, Miriam's speech continued for approximately 7 minutes before stopping abruptly. When it ceased, she raised her head and stared directly at the priest. Her pupils were dilated. Her voice, when she spoke again in plain Urdu, was steady. "It is not for you," she said. The priest asked what she meant. She did not answer. Instead, she turned to the wall and lifted her hand, pressing her palm against it as she had done months earlier in the hallway. The priest noted that her breathing slowed to almost nothing, as though her body expected to listen rather than speak. When the rite concluded, the priest documented the session as resistant. Such classification indicated that the presence within the host was not merely enduring the rite but attempting to interfere with it. What came the following week confirmed that assessment. The church expected escalation during active rites. They did not expect escalation between them. 3 days after the second session, Nadia was found in the courtyard at dawn, standing barefoot on the cold tiles. She claimed she had woken there, though there was no evidence of forced movement or violence. When asked why she had gone outside, she replied that Miriam had asked her to keep watch. When questioned later, Miriam denied speaking to her sister at any point during the night. 2 nights later, Farid woke screaming, insisting there were people standing near the ceiling, too many to count. During this same period, Amir developed insomnia so severe that his hands trembled constantly. Samina began complaining of persistent nausea and aversion to food. According to a physician familiar with the family, both adults showed signs of sympathetic nervous system stress without identifiable medical cause. The church attributed these symptoms to infestation and believed the house itself had become compromised. In possession cases with black magic origins, infestation typically manifests along spatial lines, with thresholds, corners, attics, and courtyards serving as spiritual vectors. The uncle's house had all 4. The third phase of the rite was scheduled without delay. This session took place in the attic. The decision was intentional. The attic was the one room where all family members reported discomfort. The twins refused to enter it. Samina claimed she heard footsteps above her bed at night, though the attic floor was too fragile to support human weight. Amir claimed it smelled of wet earth even when dry. The priest believed that whatever anchored the attachment to the land and property likely had a locus in the attic structure. He brought consecrated oil, a small wooden crucifix, and the Book of Rites. The attic door opened with difficulty. Dust hung in the air. The space was low, cramped, and unfinished, with exposed beams and insulation that had frayed into damp fibers. The single window looked out toward the fields. Miriam entered without resistance. She stood near the center of the attic, her arms at her sides, her breathing shallow but steady. The rite began. Within minutes, the atmosphere changed. The silence inside the attic thickened, then warped. The priest later described it as a sensation of sound being displaced, as though the room was holding its breath. Amir stood at the base of the ladder, refusing to step inside. The priest read from the rite for 20 minutes. Miriam remained still. Then she spoke without opening her mouth. At first it was only vibration, low and dissonant, as though sound resonated from her throat without air. Then the voice formed words. The church recorded the phrase phonetically. Scholars suggested it referred to the buried ones. The priest continued reading. The attic floor creaked under no apparent weight. A small beam near the window cracked loudly, releasing a puff of dust. The priest anointed the beams with oil. As he reached the final beam, Miriam turned her head sharply and exhaled with such force that dust scattered across the floor. When the priest pressed the crucifix to her forehead, she spoke again, this time in Urdu. "He is here." The priest asked who she meant. She raised one finger and pointed toward the far end of the attic, where shadows gathered near an old crate. The priest stepped forward, reading louder. The crate rattled once. Something inside shifted. Amir called out for the priest to stop, but he continued, pressing the rite to conclusion. The moment the final lines were spoken, Miriam collapsed onto her knees. Her eyes rolled back briefly, then opened. She whispered, "He wants the house." The priest asked why. Miriam shook her head, as though the answer was either unknown or forbidden. The session ended with no violence, no convulsions, and no screams. Yet the church considered it the most dangerous session performed to that point. The attachment had revealed intent. Possession was not the end goal. Dominion was. After the attic rite, the church decided to investigate the land itself. They studied property records and learned that the field behind the house had once been a burial site for unclaimed bodies during a cholera outbreak decades earlier. According to municipal documents, the graves were shallow and unmarked. Over time, development overtook the area, burying the history beneath irrigation and farmland. In folklore concerning black magic attachment, Unmarked dead were often utilized not for their spirits but for their anonymity. A site without remembrance was considered spiritually accessible, its boundary weakened by neglect and forgetfulness. This discovery shifted the church's interpretation of the case. The family had not merely moved into a house affected by black magic. They had moved onto land chosen for its ability to host it. Meanwhile, Miriam's condition progressed into a new phase. She no longer withdrew. She walked through the house with deliberate curiosity, touching objects as though memorizing their textures. She ran her fingers along walls, stopped in doorways, and paused at windows as if checking vantage points. During meals, she ate in silence and observed the others with controlled interest. The twins avoided meeting her eyes. Amir insisted that she sleep with the door open, but she rarely slept at all. She sat awake at night, humming softly in a language no one recognized. The fourth phase of the rite was scheduled for late November. The church prepared for direct confrontation. Black magic possession cases rarely responded to incremental displacement. The presence had coiled itself into the host's identity too tightly. Removal would require force. The rite was held in the living room. The priest arrived with an assistant. Candles were lit, not for symbolism, but for practical measurement of air displacement. Erratic flickering often indicated unseen movement. The twins were again relocated. Samina sat beside Amir, clutching a rosary until her hands trembled. Miriam entered without hesitation and sat in the chair designated for the host. Her posture was straight. Her expression was blank. The rite began at 11:44 p.m. The first hour passed with no reaction. The priest intensified the ritual cadence, invoking liberation and severance. Miriam's body tensed. She inhaled sharply, then whispered something that resembled laughter but contained no amusement. Then the manifestations began. The candles flickered erratically. The curtains on the far wall swayed inward as though a wind had passed through the house, though the windows were sealed. The floorboards beneath the chair vibrated faintly, then stopped. The priest continued, raising the volume. Miriam's voice layered again. 2 tones, then 3, overlapping without breathing. Her eyes remained open, pupils widened, unfocused. According to the assistant's notes, the voices spoke in multiple registers simultaneously. 1 high, 1 low, 1 neutral. The content was unintelligible at first. Then, as the rite reached its midpoint, the voices resolved into coherent speech. The assistant wrote down every word. The voices claimed the family had been opened. They claimed the land had been prepared. They claimed the girl had been chosen not for weakness but for suitability. The priest demanded a name. The voices did not respond. When pressed again, Miriam lifted her head and spoke clearly in Urdu. Names are for those who leave. The priest invoked the authority of the rite. Miriam's lips curled as though amused. Then, without transition, she fell silent. This silence was different from earlier manifestations. It did not feel empty, felt attentive. The priest continued reading. The silence persisted. The assistant wrote in the margins. It feels as if the room is listening. Then Miriam's chest began to rise and fall in irregular patterns, as though her lungs were attempting to match an external rhythm. The priest pressed the crucifix to her sternum and commanded the presence to relinquish its host. At that command, the silence broke. A voice spoke through Miriam, deeper than before, but not violent. It said, "She is not the only door." Amir cried out. The priest raised his voice. Samina began shaking uncontrollably. The assistant noted that the temperature in the room dropped to an estimated 5 degrees Celsius, though this could not be confirmed instrumentally. The rite continued for another 30 minutes. When it concluded, Miriam collapsed forward, nearly sliding from the chair. Amir carried her to the bedroom. She slept for nearly 20 hours. The church classified the fourth session as successful but incomplete. The presence had weakened, but not withdrawn. And a new threat had emerged, the implication that the infestation had begun migrating. Over the next week, that implication proved true. Farid began vomiting at night. Nadia developed intense anxiety and refused to speak after sunset. Samina reported hearing footsteps behind her in empty rooms. Amir felt as though someone stood behind him whenever he prayed. Medical tests found nothing abnormal. The church debated whether to proceed with the final rite or relocate the family temporarily to prevent the infestation from securing additional hosts. Relocation was deemed risky. Spiritual attachments sometimes travel with the afflicted, intensifying outside their origin point. Better to confront it on the land where it was anchored. The final rite was scheduled for the second week of December. In the days leading up to it, Miriam's behavior changed in subtle but disturbing ways. She began avoiding mirrors. She refused food for 3 days, claiming she was not hungry. She pressed her ear to the wall near the staircase as though listening for movement. On the evening before the final rite, she walked into the courtyard barefoot and stood in the center of the tiles, staring at the gate. When Amir asked what she was looking at, she replied, "They are already inside." That night, no one in the house slept. The final rite began at nightfall. The priest arrived with 2 assistants and a sealed case containing sacramentals and documentation. The twins remained in the house this time. The church had determined their presence necessary. Possession cases rooted in black magic often relied on familial interconnection, and exclusion sometimes strengthened the presence's hold on the host. Miriam sat on the floor, refusing the chair. The priest permitted it. The rite commenced. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted violently. The bulbs dimmed until the room glowed with only a dull amber hue. The temperature dropped. The twins clung to Samina. Amir stood behind Miriam, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. The priest invoked authority over the presence. The response came immediately. Miriam's back arched sharply, but not in contortion. It resembled the motion of someone being pulled from behind by unseen hands. Her breath stuttered. Her eyes rolled upward, exposing only the whites. The voices returned. This time they did not layer. They alternated male, female, child, whisper, low growl, coherent speech, cycling so rapidly that the assistant struggled to keep pace in transcription. The priest pressed the rite forward, invoking liberation and expulsion. The voices responded in the unknown language, then switched to Urdu, stating, "She is bound." Bound to what the priest demanded. Miriam's head jerked to the side. She whispered, "To the buried." The priest invoked the power to sever spiritual bonds. The lights flickered again. The curtains twisted inward. The crucifix in the priest's hand vibrated faintly. Then the voices began to chant. The chant did not resemble prayer. It resembled instruction. The assistant noted that the cadence matched burial rites from regions associated with black magic operations. The priest intensified his invocation, speaking over the chant. Miriam shuddered violently, but did not scream. And then something in the house shifted. The floorboards near the staircase cracked loudly. The twins screamed. Amir rushed toward them, but stopped suddenly, as though repelled by something unseen. The priest demanded that the presence reveal its purpose. Miriam opened her mouth to speak, but what came out was not speech at all. It was breath, slow, deep, and deliberate. Then, in a voice that was unmistakably not her own, she said, "It is almost finished." In late September, as the monsoon gave way to a dry and silent autumn, the family's condition deteriorated in a way that alarmed both the church and the medical team. According to the hospital logbook, Mahmoud refused to eat for 3 consecutive days, stating plainly that any food placed before him smelled of soil and rot, even when it was freshly prepared. Dr. Qureshi wrote that the aversion to food was accompanied by unusual sensory distortions and episodes of apparent dissociation. Yet tests for infection, metabolic disorders, and neurological anomalies yielded nothing. Samra experienced a milder but similarly disturbing progression. She began waking at 3:07 a.m. exactly, every single night for 9 nights in a row. Her mother reported that her eyes opened suddenly, without flinching, without breathlessness, and without confusion. She simply sat up, stared toward the corner of the room, and whispered faint phrases that sounded like responses to unheard questions. When asked in the morning, she had no memory of speaking or waking. The behavior was captured once on a small CCTV device that Hassan had set up for his own peace of mind. The footage, later viewed by the priest, showed Samra rising slowly with no signs of sleep paralysis or panic. The timestamp read 3 hours 7 minutes and 14 seconds. Her lips moved, but the audio only captured faint disturbances, too quiet to parse. There was something eerie about the angle of her head, as though she were listening to a distant voice. Miriam, however, was the most vulnerable. She began speaking of shadows moving behind people, as if every person in the house had a second form lurking in delayed movements. These visual disturbances frightened her deeply, and one evening, close to sunset, she panicked and begged her mother not to let Mahmoud near her. She said the shadow behind him was larger and leaned forward as if sniffing her. The mother confided later in a church interview that she tried to dismiss it as hallucination or fear, but Miriam's voice seemed certain, unwavering, and far too calm for a child. She was not crying, and that composure is what unsettled her. It was as if Miriam had accepted the presence before anyone else did. According to Father Rodrigo's notes, the psychological component at this stage was undeniable but insufficient to explain the synchronized patterns. He arranged a formal blessing of the house. He performed it on October 3rd. The family gathered in the living room while he sprinkled holy water, recited the litany of the saints, and placed a candle upon the table. He later said the house smelled faintly of something akin to burnt hair, though he found no source for it. The candle flickered aggressively even though no windows were open and the air was calm. More notable was Miriam's reaction. When the priest touched her forehead lightly with the sign of the cross, Miriam flinched sharply, not in pain but in recoil, and stared at him as if she did not recognize him. The tension in the room rose, and Samra began trembling. None of them could have predicted that the blessing would provoke rather than ease the phenomena. 2 nights after the blessing, the family awoke to knocks on the living room wall. 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced. Hassan searched the house thinking it might be the neighbors or a stray animal against the exterior, but no patrol of the perimeter showed signs of impact. The knocking recurred for 9 nights, always in groups of 3, always shortly after Miriam fell asleep. On the 9th night, Samra woke again at 3:07 a.m., but this time she screamed. The CCTV camera captured what looked like her hair being lifted slightly by a draft that did not move the curtains. Her mother rushed into the room in seconds. Samra was still seated upright, eyes wide open, but now she cried uncontrollably, unable to articulate what she had seen. When morning came, she described a presence sitting on her bed, leaning its weight on the mattress. She could not see a face, only the impression of someone leaning forward with both hands placed beside her. According to Samra, it felt colder than anything she had ever experienced, as if the air itself had been replaced with something dead and unmoving. The priest insisted that the house be examined more thoroughly. Hassan agreed and brought in a contractor who specialized in renovation and repair. The contractor inspected the basement, the attic, the crawl spaces, and the outer boundary of the property. Nothing unusual surfaced until he reached a small storage closet built under the old staircase. The closet had been inaccessible for years due to warped wood. Once pried open, the contractor discovered a shallow recess in the cement floor, barely the size of a shoebox. Inside it was a deteriorated cloth pouch tied with rough twine. When the pouch was lifted, it broke apart. Clay-like dust spilled across the floor, mixed with strands of hair, rusted pins, and something that smelled strongly of camphor. According to church accounts, the pouch contained a rolled paper fragment with ink symbols and a name written in Urdu, partially smudged but still legible: Miriam Babur. The discovery changed the direction of the investigation. Until that point, the ordeal might have been interpreted as a blend of illness, stress, and family trauma. The pouch suggested intention. Someone had targeted them. Father Rodrigo contacted an acquaintance knowledgeable in South Asian occult traditions, particularly practices associated with black magic curses used to harm families or disrupt living lines. This consultant remarked that the combination of hair, clay dust, pins, and naming was consistent with techniques intended to bind a victim spiritually and weaken them psychologically. The camphor scent, if deliberate, might indicate the ritual had been performed to attract certain entities into proximity with the victim. He commented that camphor and soil in black magic are commonly used to tether the curse to the house rather than just the body. According to church testimony, this revelation deeply shook the family. They suspected immediate neighbors but hesitated to accuse anyone. What troubled the priest most was that the artifact seemed old. The pouch might have been placed there long before Mahmoud and Samra were old enough to exhibit symptoms. If that was true, the curse was not spontaneous retaliation or modern feud. It was an operation set in motion years earlier. Following the discovery, the house grew quiet, not in a comforting sense, but in a suffocating one. For 5 days, no knocks occurred, and Samra slept without disturbance. Yet Mahmoud reported dreams of being pulled through soil by unseen hands, waking with dirt beneath his fingernails though no soil was present in the bed. Maryam developed fever episodes that appeared without biological explanation and vanished within hours. The stillness, the priest believed, was not remission but preparation. In mid-October, the consultant in Karachi sent a detailed document describing how such curses were often activated through lunar cycles. He noted the pouch contained materials indicative of a slow possession operation, one that begins by eroding the victim's dreams and weakening their autonomy, then drawing something closer over time. The mention of lunar stages prompted the priest to check the dates of Samra's nightly awakenings. They aligned with the waxing cycle leading to a full moon. The psychological toll intensified. Samra, previously resilient, became irritable and withdrawn. The mother stated in private that her daughter no longer felt present in the room when spoken to, as if attention had become a mask rather than a response. Mahmoud, once calm under pressure, now argued aggressively over insignificant matters, often about Maryam, insisting that Maryam was not the same child anymore. His language became sharp and cold. Maryam, for her part, withdrew into silence. According to notes from the family's uncle, she sat often at the foot of her bed, staring into the hallway as though waiting for someone. By late October, the church determined that spiritual intervention was unavoidable. The blessing had failed, the black magic evidence was undeniable, and the family was unraveling under coordinated pressure. The diocese approved a formal evaluation for an exorcism. Protocol required medical sign-off to eliminate neurological or psychiatric explanations. The doctors cooperated reluctantly but signed, stating they could not account for the phenomena and believed further stress would escalate risk of harm. The first attempt began on November 2nd. The priest arrived with 2 assistants and a small collection of sacramentals. He anointed the house, then gathered the family in the living room. According to his diary, the objective was not yet expulsion but identification. He began with prayers of discernment, attempting to evaluate attachment, influence, and locus of spiritual interference. The ritual lasted 3 hours. During that time, Samra breathed heavily and pressed her hands against her ears whenever prayers intensified. Mahmoud stared at the candle on the table without blinking for extended periods. Maryam remained quiet until the priests recited the litany of the holy angels. At that moment, the child turned away sharply and crouched behind her mother, as though something unseen approached from the center of the room. Near the end of the session, the priest noted a sudden temperature drop. Everyone present felt it simultaneously. The candle dimmed but did not extinguish. The priest closed the session and instructed the family not to argue, not to isolate themselves, and above all not to sleep alone. He left the house with a sense of urgency. The diary notes that he felt the house was no longer merely hosting a curse but housing something that had taken advantage of it. A week passed without direct escalation, but the psychological grip tightened. According to the uncle, Mahmoud began speaking at night in a tone that did not belong to him. It was deeper, monotone, and clipped. He sometimes spoke Urdu, sometimes a language the uncle did not recognize. The words were spoken as if answering questions that only he could hear. One night, the uncle asked who he was talking to. Mahmoud froze and turned to him with a look that, in his words, did not belong to someone awake. The uncle withdrew immediately. On November 16th, the family experienced the most severe occurrence. At 2:51 a.m., The house awoke to the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. Hassan ran downstairs and found the cupboard doors wide open, as if pulled outward with force. Plates and glasses lay broken across the floor. He checked for signs of intrusion, but the house was secure, doors locked, windows shut. CCTV footage later reviewed by the priest showed no figure entering the kitchen. The cupboard doors simply opened one by one, without visible cause, before the contents fell to the floor in succession rather than all at once. The pacing of the movement disturbed everyone who saw it. That morning, Samra refused to sit near the kitchen door. She said something was standing there and watching. When her mother insisted nothing was present, Samra pointed and described a figure without eyes, but not blind, only empty, as though the sockets had been hollowed. The child then looked away, shivering, refusing to elaborate. After this incident, the diocese authorized a major exorcism. According to church procedure, the rite would target the suspected spiritual presence, attempt expulsion, and destroy the residual influence of the black magic curse. The priest planned the session for December 3rd. This allowed time to prepare sacramentals, blessed oil, and relics, and to secure cooperation from the consultant regarding any counter-ritual effects from the occult side. The consultant warned that black magic curses of this type often fought back during final rites, creating distractions, illusions, and manifestations intended to break the ritualist's concentration or turn family members against one another. The priest noted that some rites failed not because the entity resisted but because the human targets cracked psychologically under pressure. In the days leading up to December, Miriam's condition worsened significantly. She began refusing to speak entirely and often stared at corners as if observing movement where none existed. The uncle described one alarming evening when Miriam stood motionless in the living room and slowly raised her hand as though greeting someone. She said nothing and did not react when spoken to. She only lowered her hand after several minutes and returned to her room. What disturbed the uncle was that her movements looked mimicked, as if she were copying someone else's gesture rather than acting independently. The night before the scheduled exorcism, the priest received a call from the family. Mahmoud had begun laughing uncontrollably. The laughter did not sound hysterical, nor cheerful. It was flat, measured, and continuous. It lasted for nearly 5 minutes before abruptly stopping. When the family tried to ask what had happened, he said only that he found something very amusing, but he could not remember what. He then walked to the balcony, stared into the neighborhood for several minutes, and returned to bed without speaking. According to the priest, laughter of that nature often indicated psychological break under strain or the mockery typical of possession cases. The distinction was difficult to assess. When December 3rd arrived, the priest and his assistants entered the house just after sunset. He instructed the family to remain together, no matter what sounds or reactions followed. He established the living room as the ritual site and closed the curtains to remove outside influence. He lit a candle brought from the church, placed relics on the table, and positioned Miriam at the center of the room. Miriam did not resist, nor did she speak. The priest opened with prayers of protection and authority. The house felt heavy, according to witnesses. Even the assistants noted that the air seemed dense, as if charged with static. 20 minutes into the rite, Samra began breathing heavily and pressed her hands to her face. Mahmoud stared at the floor, unfocused, as if listening. The priest recited the rite of exorcism with slow, deliberate pacing. The candle flame elongated unnaturally, bending sideways as though pulled. He continued, invoking authority, commanding any unclean spirit to reveal itself. For several minutes, nothing occurred. Then Miriam's head lifted abruptly. Her eyes widened, and her breathing changed, no longer shallow or frightened, but controlled. The child stared at the priest without blinking. The priest addressed the presence directly. According to his account, the room vibrated with tension, though no physical shaking occurred. The candle flickered violently. The relics remained still. When the priest commanded the entity to identify itself by sign if not by speech, Miriam's hand lifted slowly, pointing toward the staircase. The priest's assistant later said the gesture was identical to the unfamiliar greeting described by the uncle days earlier. The implication was clear. Whatever presence lingered in the house resided near or above the staircase, likely where the black magic artifact had been discovered. The priest redirected the rite toward the house itself, acknowledging that the curse might have summoned or anchored something rather than directly possessing Miriam alone. He sprinkled holy water toward the staircase. The candle dimmed again. Samra coughed sharply and began weeping, though she could not explain why. Mahmoud curled inward, holding his head as though experiencing auditory overload. The command for departure intensified. The priest's voice did not waver. According to notes, he alternated between invocation and condemnation, a standard structure designed to weaken spiritual foothold. For nearly an hour, Miriam remained motionless, eyes open, unblinking. Her mother clutched her arm tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Then the house made a sound that no one could locate, something between a groan and a long exhale, heard not through the walls but through the air itself. The assistants looked at the priest, who did not stop reciting. When he reached the final command of authority, the lights in the house extinguished simultaneously. The candle remained lit. In darkness, Samra screamed. She pointed toward the base of the staircase. Her voice shook as she said something was standing there. She described its height, taller than the doorframe, its posture leaning forward and its gaze fixed on Miriam. The priest did not look, only intensified the command for expulsion. The candle flame rose nearly twice its height, vibrating as if struggling against wind that did not exist. Miriam's face contorted for the first time since the rite began. Not in pain, but in confusion, as though she were experiencing displacement. Her hands clenched, then released. Her breathing faltered. The priest delivered the final condemnatory phrase. For a moment, the house fell into silence so total that even the sound of breathing felt diminished. Then something moved on the staircase. It was slow, deliberate, and descending. The sound on the staircase faded, not because it ceased, but because it became quieter than perception, slipping out of the audible world as though retreating through a layer of air beyond human reach. The candle flame steadied. The house lights remained off. No one spoke. The priest closed the ritual abruptly, not out of panic but because the presence had removed itself from the living room without confrontation. According to his diary, in cases of black magic, anchored possession, retreat often indicated transition rather than defeat. The entity did not accept eviction. It merely relocated. Once the rite concluded, the priest instructed the family to remain together in the living room until dawn. No one slept. The atmosphere did not ease. If anything, the air felt watchful, as though attention had shifted from the center of the house to its periphery. Miriam rested with her head in her mother's lap. Samra leaned against her father, trembling intermittently. Mahmoud stared at the staircase without expression. At dawn, the priest left to secure additional sacramentals and to consult the diocese. His assistants remained behind. The church had expected resistance, but the behavior of the presence suggested a strategic intelligence consistent with older, more deliberate operations. The consultant was contacted again, and after reviewing the details, he warned that curses of this type often required closure of the origin, meaning that unless the point of summoning was destroyed, the entity would continue to roam the house even if temporarily driven out of a host. The origin, he explained, was rarely a single object. It was the sum of actions, burial materials, naming spells, and location. Someone had crafted an apparatus that the house itself now contained. Removal of the pouch had not ended the curse. It had merely exposed it. On December 8th, the family was asked to vacate the house temporarily for evaluation. They relocated to the uncle's residence 10 kilometers away. For 2 days, the house sat empty. According to the contractor who returned to inspect it, the interior remained cold. Dust had accumulated in odd patterns, forming streaks along the banister and clustering near the staircase alcove. There were no footprints, no leaks, no sign of water damage. The contractor remarked that it felt like something was still walking, just not on the floor. During the family's absence, symptoms followed them. Samra woke twice during the night at the uncle's home. Again at 3:07 a.m. Maryam developed a fever that broke before morning. Mahmoud reported dreams of soil, this time mixed with whispered voices speaking in faint Urdu phrases he could not fully remember. These signs indicated that the curse was no longer tied to the structure alone, but to the individuals it had selected. The diocese concluded that a second, more authoritative rite was necessary, one that targeted both the presence and the curse itself. The consultant insisted that without ritual counteraction, the black magic elements would continue to feed whatever had been summoned. He provided the priest with a written outline of counter-ritual precautions used in similar cases: continuous prayer cycles, destruction of naming residues, cleansing of burial components, and isolation of the intended host. Before the second rite could begin, the consultant posed a crucial question: who was the target? Although Maryam's name had appeared in the pouch, her symptoms were not the only ones escalating. The consultant pointed out that black magic curses often used the youngest as the conduit but attached to the family as a system, transferring from child to sibling to parent depending on resistance. The question unsettled the priest. If the curse moved among the family members, expulsion would require separating them, at least spiritually, during the ritual. According to correspondence preserved by the diocese, the consultant believed the curse was intended to break the family unit entirely, fragmenting emotional bonds and leaving one member spiritually vacant for occupation. He estimated that the entity had been grooming Maryam as the conduit but pushing Mahmoud psychologically, probing weaknesses, testing access. Samra was the observer, the one who saw but could not intervene. This triangulation was consistent with traditional accounts of possession through ritual black magic. The curse did not seek spectacle. It sought permanence. The second exorcism was scheduled for December 19th, this time at the church rather than the house. The decision removed the entity from its territorial advantage, forcing it into a consecrated environment. The family was instructed to fast lightly and avoid arguments. A psychologist was brought in for silent observation to record behavioral deviation for documentation. On the evening of the rite, the family was seated in the small exorcism chapel. The lights were dim, the walls bare except for a crucifix and a table of relics. Maryam was placed in the center. Samra sat nearest to her. Mahmoud was positioned to the right, monitored closely. Their parents stood behind them. The priest began the rite without any introductory address to the family. The Latin prayers echoed softly against stone. The candle's steady flame illuminated Maryam's face. Her expression was neutral. 30 minutes elapsed without reaction. The psychologist noted only signs of tension and alertness. When the priest read the authority command, Maryam's breathing changed. She inhaled deeply, slowly, and her eyes narrowed as though adjusting to light. She raised her hand halfway, then lowered it. Her gaze tracked the priest's movements with unnatural precision. The consultant observed silently from the back of the chapel. His attention remained divided between Maryam and Mahmoud. The curse was not expected to remain in one body for long. Movement was part of its design. During the litany, Samra leaned toward her sister and whispered that her shadow had gone missing. The mother overheard and asked what she meant. Samra replied that Maryam's shadow was no longer touching her feet on the floor. The mother looked down immediately. The light from the candle cast shadows faintly, distorted by its position. It was difficult to confirm or deny. The priest continued the rite uninterrupted. At the command of revelation, Maryam stiffened. Her head tilted back slowly. Her arms extended outward as if suspended. Her expression did not show pain but vacancy, an absence of self rather than presence of another. The psychologist noted that there were no signs of seizure or muscular convulsion. Everything was controlled, deliberate. The priest began the condemnatory phrases. The candle flame vibrated, then steadied. According to testimonies, the chapel temperature dropped several degrees within seconds. Breath became visible. The mother gasped and wrapped her arms around herself. The priest did not break cadence. He increased intensity, driving the command against the presence. At the sixth repetition, a sound escaped Maryam's throat. Not a scream, not a voice, but a prolonged exhale that did not require inhalation. The psychologist's notes indicate that the exhale lasted nearly 22 seconds beyond what would normally be possible for a child without strain. The priest pressed forward with the climactic command. Suddenly, Mahmoud lurched forward, clutching his head. He groaned and muttered words that sounded like Urdu but broken, archaic, and without clear structure. The consultant rose from his seat. Samra began crying softly, repeating that the shadow had returned. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Samra kept pointing toward Miriam. Miriam's body slumped forward abruptly as though something had departed through her spine. She did not collapse, only bent, suspended at the waist before slowly rising again. Her face remained expressionless. Her eyes rolled slightly upward and then stabilized. The priest delivered the termination command. For several seconds, the entire family froze in place. No movement, no sound. Even the candle ceased flickering. Then Miriam blinked. The shift was subtle, but it was enough. Her expression regained familiarity. She looked at her mother and leaned into her without resistance. The priest closed the rite cautiously, aware that possessions tied to black magic often incorporate decoys, moments of apparent remission before the true entity reasserts itself elsewhere. The psychologist noted that Mahmoud did not return to baseline. He remained seated, head lowered, muttering intermittently. His words alternated between silence and fragments of prayer. The consultant approached slowly and listened. After several seconds, he stated that the entity had dislodged from Miriam but was not gone. It was seeking a new foothold. The family returned home 2 days later. The house felt quieter. Objects did not move. No knocking occurred. Samra slept through the night. For a brief period, the family believed the crisis had ended. That belief fractured on January 4th, when Mahmoud vanished from his room during the night. His mother found the balcony door open and the boy standing barefoot on the terrace, staring at the neighborhood. When she called to him, he did not respond. She approached slowly. His eyes were open, his posture rigid. She touched his shoulder. He turned, looked directly at her, and said, in a tone that did not belong to a child, that he could hear the soil. When asked what he meant, he remained silent. Eventually, he allowed himself to be guided inside. The priest returned to the house the same afternoon. He questioned Mahmoud gently. The boy could not remember the terrace or the words he spoke. The diocese approved a third and final intervention, one not focused solely on exorcism, but on neutralizing the black magic apparatus. The consultant suggested that whoever placed the original curse likely performed it near a burial location or used cemetery soil directly. Such acts bind the presence to death rather than to place. He recommended taking a small amount of holy oil and blessed salt to the site where the pouch had been found and performing a counter-ritual to sever the line between the curse and its source. On the evening of January 9th, the priest descended into the storage closet beneath the staircase. The family waited in the living room. The consultant assisted with the preparation. The basement air felt stale, as though it had been trapped for years. The concrete recess where the pouch had been found remained visible. The salt and oil were placed upon the recess. The priest began the counter-ritual. As he prayed, a faint scratching sound emerged from inside the walls. The consultant advised him to continue. The scratching intensified, spreading along the baseboards and up the stairwell, as if something were moving through the house in response. The priest repeated the severing command. The walls quieted briefly. Then, as the priest placed the final sprinkling of salt, the staircase groaned. According to his account, it was not the sound of wood shifting, but something ascending or descending with weight. Too heavy for a child, too deliberate for settling. The priest concluded the ritual, sealed the recess with blessed oil, and returned upstairs. When he emerged, Mahmoud was waiting at the top of the stairs. His expression was vacant, his posture straight. The priest approached cautiously. Mahmoud inhaled slowly, as though testing the air, and exhaled in a manner reminiscent of Miriam during the first rite. The priest placed his hand upon the boy's forehead and spoke quietly, invoking peace and release. Mahmoud blinked several times and seemed to return to himself. The consultant instructed the family to open the windows. The air flowed through the house, carrying with it a scent the mother later described as damp earth mixed with burnt camphor. For 2 weeks afterward, the house remained uneventful. The family slept. The children went to school. No disturbances occurred. The diocese monitored from a distance, awaiting signs of relapse. In February, the priest visited for a follow-up inspection. He found the house brighter, warmer, and ordinary. Miriam appeared healthy. Samra spoke without trembling. Mahmoud smiled awkwardly but genuinely. The priest documented the case as resolved. Yet the consultant, when filing his own account, wrote that curses of this type rarely end cleanly. He observed that the house maintained a lingering silence in certain rooms, particularly near the staircase, as if the space remembered something that had once stood there. He recommended the family not store anything beneath the stairs again. Years later, former neighbors recalled the case with unease. Some claimed the family had been targeted due to envy. Others believed old disputes had resurfaced in secret. No one could identify who performed the black magic ritual. The family never discovered the perpetrator, and the consultant believed that was intentional. In curses driven by hatred rather than revenge, anonymity amplifies potency. The victim suffers without knowing whom to forgive or whom to fear. The diocese retains the case in its sealed files. Physicians who reviewed the medical data remain unable to reconcile the collective symptoms. The psychologist concluded that fear alone could not account for the synchronized events. The consultant moved on to other investigations. But those who entered the house after the family relocated reported one final detail. On quiet evenings, when light touched the stairwell at a specific angle, a faint smudge appeared on the wall near the storage closet, shaped not like a stain, but like the outline of someone standing and listening, as though waiting for the family to return. Nothing further was recorded.